Sarnecki is the Executive Director of the Alberta Catholic Schools Trustees Association. He's been a teacher for many years. He's brings to Alberta's national-wide breadth of experience, and particularly the Catholic educational system in our province. And he's a candidate at the University of Alberta for a PhD, where he's focusing on teacher formation and secularism, and particularly the work of Charles Taylor. So let's welcome Mr. Sarnecki.
Thank you. I'm not sure why I'm so flustered this morning. I couldn't sleep last night. I put a belt on and I'm afraid my pants are going to fall off. I was staring at my phone in the kitchen this morning and I walked into a chair and I think I broke a toe in my left foot. You know, I've spent the entire career talking to high school and junior high kids about God and religion. And I'm beginning to think my issue today is you guys actually might listen to me. It's an honor to participate in the symposium. However, unlike my learned colleagues, I feel somewhat handicapped in this endeavor, for I don't see myself as an academic, but more of a teacher and an evangelist sharing the good news in schools to our young people. Really, literally the edges of society. I have spent far more time supervising high school dances or junior high dances, lunch cafeteria supervision, pleading with students to learn anything, than studying the great thinkers and pondering questions of conscience. That said, 4 decades in the trenches of Catholic education in Alberta does provide me with some insights into the reality of Catholic education, teachers, students, trustees, and conscience rights to some extent. I'd also like to acknowledge, sorry, I wrote this note at the bottom of the page. Today is, and I don't know if this was on purpose, today is, according to the Vatican, the day of prayer for Christian persecution, including conscience persecution. My big stressor this morning is you're supposed to wear red today. I don't own any red clothing, so for next year's day, I have to go buy a red shirt. I see the challenge today as that between the rights and duties of individual conscience and the rights of the community. I think that was one of the questions that came out. In Alberta education, Bills 10, 24, and 28 over the past 5 years have challenged Catholic education in its ability to be Catholic. Where do individual rights and the rights of others begin and end? Where does the Catholic set aside his moral or her moral imperative or narrative to appease other narratives? To what extent can the majority enforce upon the minority a belief system and curriculum contrary to the moral teachings of the Church? Many people see this as tied to funding as a publicly funded Catholic education system, and yet, interestingly enough, Bills 24 and 28 around GSAs and codes of conduct impacted independent schools and homeschoolers as much as it did schools that are fully funded. Where's the line between conscience and choice? In a pluralistic society, a diverse society, where the people in it believe all kinds of different things and tolerate each other's beliefs, even when they don't match their own, different versions of truth may exist, but, as Dr. West said earlier, are accepted in traditional liberal pluralistic society. Is Alberta, then, a liberal pluralistic society? In Catholic schools that have a clear mission and purpose and understanding of truth exist if we're not allowed to be fully Catholic. Now, others today will define conscience much more succinctly than I could, but please play along a little bit here. We all invoke our consciences on a regular basis. It's not something to think of, I'm going to go home tonight and kick in my conscience and see where I'm going. Our daily decision-making in our careers, our relationships, our prayer life, and within our own selves, conscience is that voice of God in the back of our heads telling us and leading us towards good and avoiding evil. For those of us in Catholic education, it's been particularly difficult of late. And yet, upon reflection, the struggles and clashes between the spiritual and the secular, the divine and the worldly. So why would this not be reflected in a province that supports both secular and publicly funded Catholic education these tensions will exist, both external and internal, and these, to some extent, have always been there. Please indulge me, I would like to share a rather lengthy quote from Cardinal Collins of Toronto. Many of you, of course, know him as Archbishop of Edmonton many years ago. But 2 weeks ago, he was speaking at his annual Bishop's Dinner in Toronto. And, in a slightly abridged version, he may well have been referring to Alberta when he said, "We are grateful to the provincial government and other political parties for their continued support of publicly funded Catholic education through which our community engages in a 2,000-year-old tradition of Catholic education. That tradition, which is also respected by people of other faiths, enriches our whole community by offering education through the lens of Catholic faith and reason, which reveals a loving and insightful vision of the reality of the human person and of human life. In Catholic education, we journey with our young people and strive to form young leaders who are compassionate, responsible, and faithful in everything they do." He then switched gears a little later in his talk to talk about St. John Henry Newman. Again, I quote, and I apologize for my Latin. "Newman chose as the inscription on his tomb the Latin phrase ex umbras est imaginabilis in veritatem." Somebody help me out there. Anyway, which means from shadows and I can barely speak English, from shadows and illusions into truth. That well describes his life and his salutary challenge for each of us. He was a man who wanted to escape from illusion and to find out what is real, what is solid, what is reliable, what is true. So too should we, in a world at least as confused as the one in which Newman lived, and in which it is easy to be mired in illusion. Newman sought the truth and, convinced after careful study and earnest prayer that the fullness of religious truth is found in the Catholic faith, and on October 9th, 1845, he became Catholic. By doing so, he gave up his secure position at Oxford, the esteem of the ruling class, and all hope for any advancement, and joined a despised minority. In social terms, he left the winners and joined the losers, all because of his conscience. He was convinced that pursuit of the truth required that. In this also, he is a model for us, for we, like him, need to have the courage of our convictions. All people of faith, living in what is more and more an aggressively secular society, must manifest the courage of their convictions. Last paragraph from Cardinal Collins. They have reason to fear that fidelity to their convictions, based on the ancient tradition of faith and reason, because this could be an impediment to advancing in their careers, especially, this is Dean talking, in education, medicine, and other public arenas. Politics, I'm sure Mr. Scheer would talk about how this may have impacted his opportunity to be a leader in Canada. Too often, the rich wisdom of the Catholic faith and other faiths is caricatured and denied legitimacy by those who are trapped in a shallow secular mentality and who may seek to use simplistic slogans to terminate conversations. End quote. Cardinal Collins speaks of some of the external threats that we struggle with on a regular basis in education here in Alberta. But I do not believe you can separate the external pressures we receive from our own internal quest for truth. Newman encountered this truth, this conscience, which led him in all integrity to leave the comfort of his life to essentially, as Collins suggests, join the losers in social terms. That internal struggle, the quest to strive for truth, says Newman in his letter to the Duke of Norfolk, is one we all experience. For Newman, conscience is the divine law that is printed on our minds. And he quotes St. Thomas saying, "It is an impression of the divine light in us, and participation of the internal law in the rational creature." This divine law, then, imprinted upon us, our hearts and our minds, is the supreme rule of all actions and thoughts for us. And while this may suffer from refraction, says Newman, like light passing through water, it can be bent. It is within the domain of God, and whether true or not, if it is truth for you, must be followed. It is never lawful to go against your own conscience. St. John Paul, in the Splendor of Truth, reaffirms this long-held view of conscience taught by the Church. And using 1 Peter 1, we are made holy by obedience to the truth. It is difficult, however, to find truth at times, and our will to submit it, even if we find the truth, is often weak. We often give in to relativism and skepticism in the name of freedom, yet there remains, says St. John Paul, a yearning for absolute truth and a thirst to attain full knowledge of it. To take a very complex exhortation, the splendor of truth, and simplify it, as I'm going to, is a sin. But in our search for God, and in reality, the old grade 12 religion program, for those of you who are teachers here, this search for God is a search for God who is the fullness of truth and goodness. As conscience is impressed upon us by God, it is our duty and our quest to search for the truth and to strive for freedom, the freedom found when united with goodness and truth. Following Christ is literally the way, the truth, and the life for the Christians in search of the good. In my studies, I've had the pleasure of reading a fair amount of the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor. I got to put in a plug for my man, because last week he received the Joseph Ratzinger Award in Theology from Pope Francis for all his work on the intersection of secularism and religion. One of Taylor's more recent books, written together with the philosopher Jocelyn McClure, entitled Secularism and Freedom of Conscience, describes the role of conscience and freedom in Canada. To again take a very complex book and take it down to its bare essence. Taylor says there's two types of secularism. There's Republican or rigid secularism, and again, excuse those who speak French, I do not. Laïcité would be an example in the French word. That state neutrality in religion means the complete absence of religion and belief in public life, especially in services of the state, education, healthcare, and social services being an example, versus a more pluralistic liberal secularism, again, a more classic form of liberalism that has been found over the past 2 centuries coming out of the Enlightenment, historically similar to what we've found in Alberta. This pluralistic liberalism is being slowly eroded. And again, back to Dr. West and his comment, they've moved beyond this idea of accepting of many different perspectives and points of view to saying, not only must you accept my perspective, you must publicly state it and believe it, or you can no longer participate in public life. This social shift calls for a new view of secularism, freedom of conscience, and our Catholic social structures. Much of we've heard already today. Does religion and can religion be part of the public forum? And what does this mean in today's Canadian society? So, in the mess of all that commentary, just to show Dr. Topping I did my reading, what does this mean for Catholic education in Alberta and conscience? What rights and obligations, freedoms and duties do I have as Catholic teachers, with Catholic schools, and for Catholic parents? I've taught certified teachers at Newman and pre-service teachers at St. Joe's College for the past 20 years. I've taught and been an administrator in a Catholic school for over 30 years. I've served in an advocacy role working with the government and the ministry for the past 8 years on Catholic education. I have encountered questions and conflicts of conscience in me, trustees, teachers, students, and parents my entire career. These questions, and no matter what age, have always been difficult, but it appears to me that society is becoming more and more secular over time, and this elimination of the transcendent voice in our society, the ability to understand and go beyond, has actually been ridiculed and belittled, and often completely rejected. This has become more and more the norm in the past few years. Conscience rights and the freedom of conscience are being attacked and shunned in most cases to the privacy of the home or parish. Yet, as we've already discussed, there are contact points in Alberta society, anachronisms, some would say, from an ancient past, but still strong and fighting for our existence and our rights. This includes Catholic healthcare, the administration of Catholic social services, and Catholic education. Some of the challenges in Catholic education for both students and teachers, from my perspective. There't no way I'm going to be done in 2 minutes. Anyway, but I'll get back to that. I got to skip that then. Just some examples of issues of conscience in teaching. I've been reprimanded and or warned for teaching a Catholic view of the sacrament of marriage in a Catholic school. I have been vilified for talking the truth about Christian anthropology. I've been questioned as staff at some of our Catholic schools on why don't we encourage the use and enable the distribution of contraceptives in all of our elementary, junior high, and high schools. Often when I share my thoughts on sexuality, things like don't live together before you get married, even studies show it destroys marriages. I was told to stop being so direct. You know, if you continue to be so Catholic, the kids will leave our school and go to the public school. I was reprimanded by a senior administrator for that exact thing a number of times. By the way, it goes the other way, so we have to be careful here. When teaching the Trinity in a high school class, I offered the notion that God the Father is beyond gender. The scripture uses many metaphors, including an eagle and a lion, a loving mother, etc. Well, I got a call from the superintendent that the bishop had been contacted regarding my heresy because this parent was upset. Everybody knows God is a man. Jesus calls God Father. Quit messing with kids' heads. So when do you speak truth and how can you do that? I'm going to skip a couple of pages here. I believe that Catholic parents have expectations of teachers and teachings within a Catholic school. An expectation that the Catholic teacher, serving as a witness to faith and model of morality, have the right and expectation that the teacher must be formed in faith and conscience, and to the best of their conscience, committed to the pursuit of truth as revealed through the Church. That's not only an expectation, but a right of parents. The Catholic school exists wholly within the mission of the Church and the pursuit of truth and everlasting life. Yes, all people, all teachers, all staff in a Catholic school must act according to their conscience. But when they have determined the correct course of action through prayerful reflection, study, and counsel, and find that their conscience is in conflict with the mission of the school within the Church, authenticity and integrity would then suggest that one must act in accordance with their conscience. In this case, it may require them to leave the institution that they are representing, and far too often that does not happen. To do so, in other words, to remain in that school, even if you don't agree in conscience with the teaching and mission of that school and vision, would be affront to your own conscience. And last page. What about students? Catholic classrooms across Alberta are a microcosm of the society we find today. Many of our children have parents living in what we would call irregular relationships. We have grandparents and relatives who have ended their lives through medical assistance in dying. I still like suicide because I think it's more accurate. Very few of our students come from traditionally Catholic households, and discretion in teaching is called for because, as Pope Francis says, we must lead with mercy and compassion. Yet, we are also called by our faith and vision of Catholic education to present the truth. What about the place of non-Catholic students attending our Catholic schools and their consciences? Dr. Kent Donlevy of the University of Calgary addressed this in a paper entitled "The Common Good, the Inclusion of Non-Catholic Students in Catholic Schools." He speaks in the paper of the recent rise in the number of non-Catholic students attending Catholic schools. This was 10 years ago. We are now, the ACSTA believes, at a point where approximately 33% of all students attending Catholic schools in Alberta are not Catholic. He suggests the following. It is of significance for the aspect of this paper on Catholic education and the Vatican II document, education, on Christian education, should be noted. In that document, I gotta take a laugh. In that document, the Church Fathers stressed both students and parents' freedom of conscience, declaring that children and young people have a right to be motivated to appreciate moral values with a right conscience, to embrace them with a personal adherence, and together with a deeper knowledge and love of God. The paper then went on to say that it was this freedom that contributes to the highest degree of protection of freedom of conscience, the rights of parents, as well as the betterment of culture itself. So let us do all we can to stimulate our students to act for their own good. And just to finish, I think it's important, Catholic schools, your greatest existence. You know, I've often said this I'm going off notes, which means I could be another hour, sorry. The greatest purpose of Catholic education is to be the best person humanly possible. And I believe that public education in Canada is incredible. Our non-Catholic public education system does an incredible job of preparing students for the workplace for a version of success that I would suggest is different than Catholic schools. I've often said, public schools will prepare you for this life. Catholic schools should be preparing you for eternity. And formation of conscience, leading to truth, and the pursuit of that truth is the essential aspect and what differentiates Catholic education from public education. I know I'm over time.
Minutes for questions, and then we'll have a break.
Okay, hang on. If I've ever taught you, you're not allowed to ask a question.
I don't know if this is a comment or a question. I dislike the term secular because it implies to people that it is a non-belief system, when in fact, the more we talk about secular, again, it kind of relates to this idea that a state can have a conscience. But secular really is increasingly, again, just a set of beliefs that doesn't agree with our beliefs. So, you know, we say secular, which shouldn't mean you have to support killing people. That is not a secular, that is not a non-belief position. So I guess, and I think that relates equally to education. Public is secular, is it? With pride parades and with, you know, all the various, we all know. So, yeah, just I'd like you to comment on that.
See, this is where I get in trouble when I go off notes and off script. And I actually give my personal opinion, I let my conscience speak. Because sometimes, and again, this came out, conscience not always is right. Only when it aligns with truth is revealed through God. So, here's where I'm going to go. Charles Taylor, who I have been studying a fair amount, actually spends a lot of time defining secularism, and would say that over time, in the past 500 years, we've gone through 3 different definitions of what secular means. The original secular one was incredibly religious. You were simply, if you were secular, you were not a priest or a religious. Everybody else was secular. Secular 2, in the Enlightenment, came to mean separating the natural world from the transcendent world. Not that there was 2 different realities, but there was a separation in public thought. Secularism 3, which we're in right now, is a complete absence of religion in the public sphere. But what I'm finding in my experiences is the notion of religion is evolving in the sociological aspect. I'll be honest, everybody on earth, in my opinion, is religious or spiritual, which I think is, let's not go there. We are all religious. We assign ourselves to a creed, a belief system, an understanding of the world and our worldview and our place within it. I would suggest that every school, every community in Alberta, around the world, is religious. Public schools have their religions. Public schools have their belief systems, their values, their creeds, their, what's the word I'm looking for when you do rituals. They have their symbols. They have the whole thing. So we went to, okay, this is where I'm going to get in trouble. There is one religious or spirituality that not only is accepted, that if you don't bow down to in Alberta right now, you will be vilified. I went to Alberta School Board Association meetings, so this is all 61 boards, public, Catholic, and Francophone in Alberta, the last 2 days at the Westin Hotel. Every day starts with an Indigenous prayer and a smudging. If you ever got up there and said, well, I'd like to also do a Christian prayer, because let's be realistic, out of the 400 people here, I would say 350 are Christian. You can't do that. You know, treaty land acknowledgements. I agree. Indigenous people have been treated horrifically, and we need to reconcile and work towards that. But I'm finding school boards will start the day with a treaty acknowledgement every day, and then O Canada, and sometimes a prayer. And you're thinking to yourself, what are you saying then about what values you have? And I go to school board meetings, and they'll start with the treaty acknowledgement, they'll sing O Canada, and they'll sit down and say prayer. And I'll walk in and say, okay, God, King, and country. Prayer should be the central focus. And by the way, I've heard treaty acknowledgements that are longer than prayers. So how we're mixing that and what we as Catholics say in public and how we form our students, because they're being formed every time they attend an assembly. So the secular is a religion, in my opinion. I hope I didn't drift into... Oh, great. Dr. Kowalczyk, I just want to remember you to remember who hired you, and Dr. Kowalczyk works in my office as Director of Advocacy. Do we have multiple questions here? Okay. Sure. I asked her to throw me a puffball. Okay.
So I work with Dean. It's a pleasure working with Dean. He's so knowledgeable. He's been in so many arenas. He knows Catholic education from every level. And it is a pleasure and an honor for me to be working with Dean. But just like I harass him every day, I don't really see that I can let you off the hook today.
Well, there goes your raise. You know, when you speak conscience, there's implications.
I know that Dean has worked as a chaplain and for many years, and we have many chaplains in the room. Can I see by a show of hands how many we have? So I'm just wondering, Dean, if you could just share a few words about the chaplain role and your experience with it. See, it's an easy question.
Chaplain role was the hardest role I've ever done in my career. I spent 13 years as a high school chaplain at Archbishop Jordan High School in Sherwood Park. And again, I have to first off thank Newman College. Newman College led me into a world that I didn't know existed. Through the courses I took there, the people I encountered, Dr. Don McDonald, sorry, Father Don McDonald, Martin Moser, incredible coursework I took there. So, if you haven't been, get to Newman College and take courses. It'll expand your mind, develop and form your conscience. As a chaplain, however, you encounter the reality of everyday life. You get everybody in your office, because you become, to some extent, you're the God guy. When somebody dies, where was Jesus? When a family divorces, what did I do wrong? I've dealt with post-abortion trauma because a girl in grade 9 was raped and the parents felt guilty because they didn't supervise her enough. So they just said, you're fixed, you don't need counseling or help, take care of yourself. And post-abortion trauma. These are the issues I had to deal with. I also came to kids grade 10, I'm pregnant. Where do I go for an abortion? Because that's what my parents want. These are issues of conscience, but also opportunities for evangelization, sharing, and growth. For those of you who are chaplains, I commend you, because the work you're doing seriously takes the focus and mission of Catholic schools, basically refines it and puts it out there, and you become, now, there's a downside. You become the God person. Ever feel that? Liturgy has to be done, well, that's the chaplain's job. We're having Mass, we're having Father here, or the bishop's coming for Mass, well, that's the chaplain's job. Sometimes it excuses other people not to participate in these types of activities. So I really hope as chaplains you're working hard to make sure that you are not the God person. You should be one of an entire community of witnesses and mentors to these kids. You know, I look at Father Julian and Father Glenn here, who I'm assuming they walk into school and all of a sudden everything religious suddenly becomes their problems. You know, and the chaplain when they're left in the school is the same thing. We have to encourage and teach that we're all, through our baptism, priest, prophet, and king. And we have to ensure that. I don't know if I answered your question, Eugenia, but yeah, you'll get a raise. That was an easy one. Okay.
I saw Bishop David's hand first.
Oh, no.
Thanks, Dean. Dean, in the Christian East, including the Ukrainian Catholic Church, the consciousness is the mind or the will of God. And so our individual conscience and collective conscience is a reflection of that. But information of teachers and all of us is where does spiritual direction come into? That in the Christian East, the stance is the elder. It helps you in that journey. Otherwise, you're left kind of hanging. You're left on your own. Information of teachers and others, chaplains. Is there a place for spiritual direction in the formation of conscience?
Absolutely. Do we do it? Never. Okay, why? It costs money. This is going to sound horrible, but okay, I do give a talk called Warden for a Week, which is basically, should I be appointed the superintendent of a Catholic school district with all the money I ever wanted, what would that school district look like and what would you do? Spiritual formation would be a requirement of all teachers on a regular basis. We would provide, the biggest issue, and I joke about the money, the biggest issue is time. You know, again, I look back at the teachers in the room, and I was there for 30 years. You arrive at 7 a.m., you leave at 7 a.m., but you don't leave it at home or school. You take it home with you. You think about it all weekend. You know, you get a week in July where you kind of get downtime, but by the 1st of August, you're thinking about what's coming up again. And we don't take enough to form our conscience I got to the point where I was speaking so much about God, I didn't have time to talk to God. And that becomes, I think, a problem in many cases. I would bet for priests and those who teach theology that you're so deep into that, you don't have time. I recommend, and I am very poor at this, so I'm a horrible witness, but spiritual direction, finding yourself spiritual friends are essential on every staff. One of the best years or number of years I had is when I encountered a gentleman by the name of Jim Ryan, who I taught with, and another one who some of you may know, Denise Black, who was a vice principal at Trinity before she died of cancer. They were my spiritual friends who we would meet at lunch, and we would talk about issues you can't talk about in Catholic faculty or Catholic staff rooms, like Jesus and religion and spirituality and prayer. But these are things, you need those people in your lives. Formal spiritual direction. I have worked with Sister Mahone a little bit when she was at OLPH. Good spiritual direction is a lifesaver, and I think everybody should have it in the formation of their consciences, but for their souls as well. Thank you.